There are new notes, so if you come in, grab notes. We finished last week's notes. And let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask His blessing for this morning's study. Welcome, everybody. It'll help if I'm turned on. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for this morning. Thank you for your word. And I just pray that again as we study as a group together through the book of 1 Samuel, you'll continue to bless us, continue to influence us, guide us in the things that we are studying, Lord, so that your truths are in our heart and we carry those truths with us wherever we go. So just continue to guide us and open up hearts and minds to your word this morning as we study through the book of 1 Samuel. And we're just so thankful that we have this freedom to get together every Sunday morning as a group and study. And so just thank you for that. Thank you for your word. And I pray for all these things and thanks. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, this morning we will do a typical review. Then we will read. We will be in the scriptures, 1 Samuel chapter 23, and then we'll be in our notes. So you can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 23 as well, because after I go over just a brief review, we're going to be in, and we're going to read through the chapter. 1 Samuel chapter 23. Okay, review. Last week, if you recall, we studied the first 14 verses of chapter 23. That's what we got through. And when we begin chapter 23, David was in a hiding place called, if you recall, the Forest of Hereth. The Forest of Hereth, which most scholars think is very close to the city of Adullam. And Adullam exists halfway in between Gath and Bethlehem in Judah, the territory of Judah, southern Israel. Now the men who followed him had ballooned. Originally it was 400, now had ballooned to 600. And probably most, if not all, of his famous mighty men that we will study later on were probably already among this group. We're already following David at this point. Now the chapter begins when some of David's scouts informed him that the Judean city of Keilah was having major trouble with the Philistines. The Philistines were sending out raiding parties to plunder the threshing floor of the people who existed in the city of Keilah. So plenty of threshing floors were in the surrounding areas, and it became a problem as the Philistines would ride into Israelite territory and plunder those floors. Now remember, the threshing floors were flat, rounded places for threshing wheat. And these areas were totally exposed and out in the open. There was no way to defend them. They were basically indefensible. I'm on the review. All we're doing is reviewing last week. So they were attacking these threshing floors. They can't be defended. The farmers were pretty much defenseless. They would be outgunned and outnumbered by the enemy. And the Philistines were doing this because they could take the grain and they could resell it and have the grain for their people. And this was a major problem. It was causing issues with Keilah. Now, David summoned Abiathar the priest so that he can consult the Lord using the Urim and Thummim stones located in the pocket of the high priest's ritual vest called an ephod or an ephod. Now David asked the Lord, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" And the Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and deliver Keilah." Now when David, remember when he informed his men about the plan to attack the Philistines, they were not too keen on the idea. It was dangerous enough. It was dangerous to them. It was dangerous enough just protecting David from King Saul. Now they would engage the Philistines in battle. So here they're really worried about protecting David, and while they're protecting David, they have to worry about their flank. Right? So it was dangerous. This to them seemed like a little bit of a suicide mission. So David double-checked with the Lord, and I explained it, he probably must have asked something direct like, will we win or will we be successful? He did ask a different question this time of the Lord, a little bit more specifics about their success if they go down and they fight this battle. Now the Lord confirmed, and he says, arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. Now David, we talked about, is back in fellowship with the Lord. He is mentally in a good place. He is consulting the Lord in major decisions, and you can see from the language he really sees the Lord's blessing in his life. He is in a much different mental place. So with confidence, David gathered his troops with Abiathar and the ritual vest in tow. Notice, he doesn't leave Abiathar back in the forest with a contingent of men to protect the high priest. He's not going anywhere without that ritual vest and without being able to consult the Lord. So he takes Abiathar and he marches down about 3 miles south to the city of Keilah, where he routed the Philistine raiders. Now after the battle, David entered the city with his men, probably for a little R&R, so understandable, and because he was also meeting with and being hosted by some of the leading officials of the city. Some of this went on in celebration of his victory. But he was also, I think, secure in the city in case the Philistines decided to retaliate. So he was going to stay in the city for a time to make sure they were protected. Makes sense. Well, Saul got wind of this fact, that David was in the city, and saw this as his chance to capture David by surrounding the city in hopes that the leaders just might hand David over. So he gathered his men quickly and he began to march southward towards Keilah. So here, Saul's on the march. He's going to surround the city. And it was funny that when we looked at this last week, right, this happy and deluded king actually believed that it was Jehovah himself that created this golden opportunity for him to finally capture and kill David. That's how delusional he was. But David also got wind of King Saul's movements. So he consulted the Lord once again. He asked 2 questions. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? And will Saul come down just as your servant has heard? David had heard some whispers. So he asked those 2 questions. Of course, the Lord responded, he will come down, and secondly, they will surrender you. So David, without making a fuss or seeking retribution, just assembled his men and peacefully left the city and traveled south to an area of wilderness that surrounded the city of Ziph, or Ziph. All right, and so he is now in this wilderness area. Now the author offers up one last important point before we continue with today's passage. And I mentioned this at the very end. Because of a divine decree by God himself that David would be the next king of Israel, although Saul would continue to try and kill David, Saul was not allowed to kill David. He wasn't allowed. It reminds us of Satan and Job. Satan was not allowed to do what the Lord, and was only allowed to do what the Lord would let him do. In the life of Job, I'm sure Satan would have killed Job outright if he could have. But he was only allowed to do what the Lord allowed him to do. It's going to be a little bit of thematic of the end of our lesson today as we talk about the same thing. This king would try to continue to kill David until the Lord himself would personally remove him from his throne. So he would continue. He would keep it up. The Lord wasn't going to allow him to kill David, but he's going to keep trying. All right, and that's what's going on here in this passage. So let's continue the story. We're going to pick this up by looking at the rest of the chapter. But before we do that, I do want to read verses 1 through 14. And then after I read verses 1 through 14, we're going to be, now Joan will be in the lesson. And we'll pick it up at verse 15 here. But let me just give us a little context. Again, this is everything we studied last week, but let me read it over again. First 14 verses, and at 15, I'll start in the notes. 1 Samuel chapter 23. starting in verse 1. Then they told David, these are his men, okay, his spies had gone out, saying, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are plundering the threshing floors. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and deliver Keilah. But David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the ranks of the Philistines? Then David, double checking, verse 4, then David inquired of the Lord once more. And the Lord answered him and said, arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. So David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines, and he led away their livestock and struck them with a great slaughter. Thus David delivered the inhabitants of Keilah. And here we go, Hebrew writing. We have the whole broad overview of this whole event. Boom, over and done with. Now we're going to get further events, details of the events. All right, so almost like the first 5 verses were kind of an overview. Now it came about, verse 6, when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah. Actually, Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled with David to Keilah. All right, he went with him down to Keilah. That he came down with an ephod in his hand. And when it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, Saul said, here's Saul's delusion, right? God has delivered him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a city with double gates and bars. And we talked about how Keilah was a fortified city. It wasn't this little pizzly little village. All right, it was a full fortified city with walls and gates. Matter of fact, double gates and bars. So Saul summoned all the people for war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. Now David knew that Saul was plotting evil against him, so he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. Why is he asking for the ephod? Because what's inside the ephod? The Urim and Thummim stone. That's right. And David said, using the Urim and Thummim stones, listen to David's attitude, how it's changed. O Lord God of Israel, your servant has heard for certain that Saul is seeking to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down just as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant. Okay, beautiful humility there, and you see how he's seeking the Lord. Different attitude. This isn't fear anymore. And the Lord said, he will come down. And David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. Then David and his men, about 600, arose and departed. Didn't make a fuss. They just departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could. And when it was told Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the pursuit. Not for good, just temporarily. He's not going to follow David into this next area. But he'll continue. Doesn't mean that Saul gave up. It just means he didn't pursue him directly to his next area, which is the wilderness of Ziph. Now, David stayed in the wilderness in the strongholds. We're going to talk about that today. And remained in the hill country in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. Divine decree, Saul will never be able to capture and or kill David. It's the author's throwing that nice nugget in there for us. All right. That's right. Okay. Top of page 1, new notes. Let's look at verse 15, but we have a little interesting section, verses 15, and now we're in the notes, Joan, through 18, these 4 verses, right? Where has Jonathan been? Once a central character and trusted son and military leader in his father's army, now do you get kind of like an idea here as you're reading through this? He's now inconsequential. It's weird. We go all the way back. Let's kind of like take a look back at the chapters before, at least mentally. Jonathan was second in command to King Saul. He was a favored son, right? And he was involved in all these battles and in the narrative. But now Jonathan has been gone. Abner, a little bit later on, Saul's uncle has been his army general now for quite some time. Jonathan has seemingly been demoted. I wonder why Jonathan was demoted, right? And we kind of know the idea here, even though it's not spelled out here. But this is good, logical evidence that he's been demoted. There is an understandable rift between father and son. Jonathan's commitment to his father and his family duty has led him to stay at Saul's side in whatever capacity he has for him, and we don't know what that is. But he's committed to being with his father, and so he doesn't flee with David. And we talked about there is that choice he could have made. But he refuses to betray David and help his father apprehend his friend. So I think personally that he continued to campaign on David's behalf with his father, which probably did not sit well with his father, and after a while his father just didn't want to hear it. So I don't think Jonathan is involved in much of anything, and now he pops up in this section because he's going to go and he's going to find his friend David.
Plus he made a covenant with him.
Right. And, we talk about covenant because it's such an Old Testament language. Basically, David is committed and loves his friend and would never betray his friend. It's much like the commitment that we have each other here now to love one another. Right? We are called to have that commitment to each other, to be totally committed to each other in love. And I don't owe anything to any one of you guys but to love. Isn't that what we're told? You don't owe each other anything but to love. It's the same thing. It is like a covenantal language here. David and Jonathan were friends. Jonathan has promised that as a king's sons, he would never change his mind. His commitment is with David. We're going to talk about that today based on your comment here, because we have some sadness in this chapter if you've read ahead. We really do. Stuff that I just was... Anyway, we'll talk about that when we talk about this section. Jonathan visits David. Let's read what happens here. Jonathan, who is probably not really involved in much of what his father is doing, but he wants to see his friend. Now, 15, now David became aware that Saul had come out to seek his life while he was in the wilderness of Ziph at Ha-Haresh, it actually reads. We're going to talk about Ha-Haresh. So, of course, we understand that. Saul hasn't given up, right? All right. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Haresh and encouraged him in God. And we're going to talk about how easily Jonathan found David, yet Saul can't. Isn't that weird? It's like he just rose and he just found David quickly. Thus he said to him, this is Jonathan to David, do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also. So the two of them made a covenant, and again, not re-covenant. There's no re-covenant here. They had this covenant, re-established the covenant that they already had before the Lord, and David stayed at Haresh while Jonathan went to his house. Let's talk about this. During this short period of time, very short period of time, as David left Keilah, right after these events, David and his men hid in a wilderness area that existed near the city of Ziph. Now, I want you to pull up the first map for me, Harry. And you can see, can you find Adullam? The forest of Hereth is probably somewhere in and around the Adullam area. Keilah is about 3 miles south of Adullam, so that's not a really far trek. And David would have traveled southeast, and he would have passed a very, very important city where a lot of the patriarchs are buried. You know what that is? It's a city in southern Israel that begins with an H. Hebron, right? We have Hebron. And just a few miles southeast of Hebron is Ziph. Now, as usual, this is wilderness area. So the wilderness area around Ziph is called the wilderness of Ziph. And that's how you know which one is the wilderness of Judah, which is the wilderness of Ziph, it's the one that exists around that city. That's why they call it there. So there is where David is. He's in some area in and around Ziph, if you can locate where Ziph is. It's kind of directly west of En-Gedi. Just about, and George and Sharon and Pastor George and I were at En Gedi, right? We remember En Gedi, there's a cave there, right? All right, so if we went over those hills as we were facing that cave, because that's when you get off the bus, you face the cave. En Gedi is an oasis in this barren area right on the shores of the Dead Sea. Green and shrubbery and animals. It's just amazing, beautiful. But if you went past that cave and continued over those hills, very hilly, this is the hill country of Judah, and you would eventually get to Ziph. All right, you'd be in this area where David was. All right, so that's where he is in this area. They traveled roughly 13 miles southeast to reach Ziph. It's about what they did, about a day's travel, maybe a little over. Now, the people of Ziph were fully aware of David's presence. You can't be in the wilderness area with 600 men and people do not know you're there. It doesn't say that David checked in with the people there, but they knew he was in the area. And verse 14 tells us that David was moving, it says, from stronghold to stronghold in the wilderness of Ziph. Now, what this means is he wasn't staying in one position. He had some movement. He didn't take up residence in one area, or at least one position of that area. Now, the Hebrew word translated here as strongholds, it's metzad, or metzada, and it might remind you of another word here. The use of metzad, first of all, does not indicate a fortress, as in a building or like a man-made structure. If we use the word fortress, we think of it as something that man built to fortify either military or a personal location. So that's not the idea. This is not a man-made fortress. This is a natural rock fortress. It indicates high ground in an area that gives an army a vantage point in order to observe the approach of an enemy. That would be a metzad, right? So it has to be a high ground, and we saw that when we were in southern Israel, almost like mesas in the west. You know how they have those high plateaus, those high ridges? Actually, a lot like that. So there's a lot of these high places. A metzad could also include a hiding place with a natural defense barrier that makes attacking it more difficult. So you'd have to go in this area, this metzad that's high, but also has some caves and some other hiding places. These metzadas also have usually a fresh water supply so that you can hole up for a time. So when David chose these places, it was because it held the high ground with good sight lines, fresh water, and kind of these natural defenses. That's the idea of going from stronghold to stronghold. And once again, you'd have to go to southern Israel, take a look at the area, and if you saw it, a place maybe like Petra, if you've seen the pictures, you'd be like, oh my goodness, wow. So where David's hiding is very difficult to just go in and find somebody, even 600 men. Now we have a perfect example of a metzada because listen to how that sounds, right? David would have chosen this place because every 1,000 years, tourists visits a place on the shores of the Dead Sea called Masada. Now, Masada is just the Roman way, Gentile way of pronouncing the Hebrew word Metzada. They heard Metzada, they call it Masada. This is where the Jews hold up. It's just a Roman way of saying the word, this Hebrew word. So they call it Masada. So Masada is a place that we've been to. It's on a very high plateau, not necessarily a mountain per se, but a high plateau chosen as a safe place to hide and defend ancient Israelites. Now, between the times of 37 and 31 BC, Herod the Great, right, the destroyer of the Herod that destroyed the young boys of Bethlehem, all right, same Herod the Great, the original Herod, he had 2 palaces for himself on Masada, just in case he had to make a hasty retreat for any reason. And again, giving you an idea of how this is situated on the Dead Sea side. As you look over at the Dead Sea, the drop-off is really steep. We had to take actually a cable car to the top, right? So looking at the Dead Sea, I'm standing at the top of Masada, and it is just down there, right? Cable car up And remember, when you got up to the top of Masada, I couldn't believe how many ruins were up on the top there. And the picture in your notes, Harry, can you pull up the Masada picture? You see how high it is, and there's tons of ruins up there, and it's like 15 degrees hotter. So literally, it was the hottest part of our trip, and it was like standing on top of a frying pan, no lie. I was never so hot during our tour as remember when we were on top of Masada. And for whatever reason, the touring company had us up on Masada longer than, let's say, when we were in Magdala to see the area where Mary Magdalene was born, that little area. I mean, there wasn't as much to see, but we were in Magdala for like a half hour. I think we were up on top of Masada for like 2 hours, and I was dying because there's not a lot of shade up there. You're just like on top of this plateau, and you know, there's nowhere to hide. Because a lot of the ruins, you know, if the roofing is not, you know, still there. And that was springtime. If you go on top of Masada during the summer, you know, they don't tour as much during the summer. Nobody wants to go to Israel during there. But when you're in Jerusalem and you're up about 5,000 feet, right? You're up there and it's a little cooler, and you come down off the Temple Mount out of Jerusalem, and you come to go south, and you're heading a little east. And then when you hit the Jordan River, but you hit the Jordan River and then turn south to the Dead Sea, it's like God just made a depression. And he just pushed his hand in the ground and lowered it. And you go down elevation, and then you're like, 15 degrees, honest to goodness. 65 in Jerusalem, 80 in the area of the Dead Sea. And then you get up top of Masada, and like I said, the sun is just, bam, it was up. Anyway, so here it is. You're looking out at the Dead Sea, and the Romans did not attack from the Dead Sea side. Impossible. But if you turn this way, and you look over this side, the Judean foothills, not the hill country, not the foothills, right? You look at this, the elevation's higher, right? You're looking towards Ziph, right? And the elevation, so that's the side that the Romans took to get up to Masada. They took the west side because it's closer to the top of Masada, and then they built ramparts up. So that's kind of the idea there of Masada.
Hold on. I just had a stupid comment. That's okay, your stupid comment.
No stupid comment. No comment is stupid.
So this is, you know, this picture here doesn't do it justice at all, because if you turn, you'll turn to the right maybe, you'll see the Dead Sea, and it's just beautiful. The colors, like it, the blues, it was just beautiful.
Oh yeah.
You can't explain it, but from this picture, you'd never be able to tell how beautiful it is.
No, it was. Take it from us. Yeah, it was absolutely gorgeous sight lines. I mean, I have pictures on my phone. I could even show you at some point in time what it looked like. The idea of having this in our notes is just to understand that when David goes from stronghold to stronghold, it might not have been as fancy as Masada, because it was really chosen by Herod as an extreme version of these Metsadas. But it would be, the idea is this is the kind of place that he would hide. And then when we took the tour, didn't we hear about the water source that fed Masada? But you look at this and you say, well, water source? You're in the middle of the desert. There is a water source that they would come down the mountain and they would gather water, and Masada. So it had to have a water source. David would have chosen a place like Masada, a little bit, of course, west of this area, turning around and looking west and over those hills where the Romans came. We're in the Ziph wilderness. There is these Masadas, just like this, high ground. David was hiding with his men. So I wanted to give you a good picture of that. So what's the bottom line? David and his men were hopping from Metzad to Metzad during this time in order to avoid Saul. That's what they were doing. Now, verse 15 and 6 actually say, at that time, Jonathan traveled to the area to meet David, and David was staying at a place, and I know it says Horesh. Horesh, that's the translators, but in Hebrew it actually says Ha-Horesh. Now, we've talked about that the two letters, or at least in the transliteration, im, at the end of the word is a suffix meaning it's plural, like our s or es. All right? So shofet is a judge. Shofetim is judges. All right? Ha is the. So he was staying at the Haresh or Ha Haresh. So some take this to mean that Haresh was like a village of some sort or an established area like Jerusalem. We have like other areas that have a specific name, but it's the name of the area, like Atlantic County. So Ha Haresh might mean something that is a very specific term. Or Ha Haresh, you could take the word Haresh, it means woods. So David was staying in the woods, Ha Haresh. So it seems that David was camped in a wooded area that existed in the wilderness of Ziph when Jonathan came to find him. It actually reminds us, I was thinking about this morning, of Robin Hood, you know, with his merry men hiding in the woods, the Sherwood Forest. Now, there's been a lot of discussion. There's no forest in south in Israel, and there's no way. And understand that if you look at the history, the topography has changed a little bit because there was a tree sale in southern Israel at some point in time where they were charged rent based on how many trees they had on their land. You can do this study yourself. And the land was wiped clean of all tree except for that little area, right, of En-Gedi. But there was other woods and foresty areas in southern Israel at the time of David. So I think it's not a strong argument to say there's no way there's woods. So David was probably, and it's not 100% out of this, you know, I can verify, Ha Haresh in the woods in a wooded area here in the wilderness of Ziph. And Jonathan, upon hearing this, hurried to go find his friend to warn him, but I think mainly to encourage him was the reason for Jonathan's trip here. And I said this earlier, isn't it funny that Jonathan had a very easy time finding David while Saul has been trying to chase David down? He just can't seem to pinpoint him. But Jonathan has it in his mind. He wants to visit his friend, and he goes and finds David just like that. He hears where David is and goes and finds him. Now, no doubt, on a natural, literal, a human level, right? David's scouts identified Jonathan when he was far off, which allowed David to guide him into his camp. So there's probably a little bit of that as well. But you can still see the Lord's work in this whole scenario, right? Saul will never be able to find David. Jonathan is going to provide encouragement to David, so the Lord allowed it. And Jonathan finds David right away. So in case that doesn't make sense to you, well, how is it Saul with his army and all his scouts? And all? The Lord, that's the answer. The Lord allows Jonathan to find David pretty easily. And they get together. Jonathan does not come to David to make a new covenant. This is just Hebrew language here. It's the way they spoke. There is no new covenant here. These details were meant to convey that Jonathan and David simply renewed their commitment to each other. And it was important for Jonathan to renew his commitment because Jonathan is still the king's son. And so Jonathan would take this opportunity to remind David that I'm with you, bud. That I'm with you. So that's the idea of this renewed. It's just a renewed commitment for each other. And he understands his friend needs encouragement. He's been hiding on the run in cliffs and in caves. So his visit was important. An encouragement. David's been on the run for quite some time here. Now, part of that encouragement was to reaffirm their love for each other. Jonathan's words, again, show also the amazing understanding of what God was doing in David's life. Like, when we hear from Jonathan, right, doesn't it tell us, like, Jonathan knew much more than the average Hebrew. And maybe it was the reason why Saul knew more than he should have known, because Jonathan kept telling him. You know what I mean? Jonathan had some insight here. Jonathan's quite a guy. I can't wait to meet him in heaven.
He even confronted his father, right?
Oh, yeah. He wasn't afraid to tell his father, what? You were wrong.
You're wrong.
You were wrong. David is loyal, and there's no reason for you. And just to remind him that you're going to be under the blood guilt. The idea of blood guilt is an important concept. And of course, Saul can't see any of this. He's blinded. He tells him, now listen to his words. Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you, and you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also. So Jonathan first exhorts David to be confident. The Lord is his protector, David's protector. And he affirms what David knows, or even if David doesn't know this, hey, his father will never find him. He's reminding David, my father will not find you. There's nothing to worry about. God's your protector. This is what he tells David. He's confident that the Lord would not allow the Lord to find his friend. Now, Jonathan again admits that it would be David who will be the next king of Israel, not himself, the prince of the land. Listen, Jonathan is the Nagid. He is the king in waiting. Of course, legally, of course, not spiritually, right? Because God has rejected him, and therefore, not through a fault of his own, the Lord has rejected Jonathan as the next king of Israel. But Jonathan, look at his humility. He understands this, what the Lord is doing. No ego, no jealousy. You're going to be the next king of Israel. And in the next phrase, my heart broke this week. My heart was broken. I don't want to be over dramatic. There was not tears running down my eyes as I wept, as I made preparations. But boy, I tell you what, very emotional this week as I read through this. I literally got really emotional when I looked at this part. Just kind of like a movie where the audience knows the end of the story, right? We know somebody's going to die. We already know the end result here, right? Sometimes that's the case, right? When we read this, the Lord and also us, and also I want you to think of the ancient Hebrews, all the king's sons, as they studied these events. They all knew what was going to happen to Saul. Everybody knows the end result, and Jonathan. Everybody knows this. Jonathan doesn't. Neither does David. We know, the readers know, that Jonathan is going to die. But he thinks that when, not if, listen, when David takes the throne, he knows beyond a doubt it's going to happen. He will sit at David as David's second in command, totally subservient and loyal to his best friend's kingdom. My heart broke. both Jonathan and David, probably take some time to imagine this future kingdom with David as king and Jonathan as his second. They might have talked about it. They're thinking about it. They're visualizing it. Jonathan is fully aware that the Lord is going to raise David up, and when that occurs, he's going to take David's side as his second. Sadly, Jonathan would die on Gilboa, fighting with his father and his brothers, and David would be heartbroken. David would be heartbroken. So literally, very, very sad thing, as Jonathan mentions. I'll be with you when you're king. I'm going to be your second. It'll be great. I can't wait. I can't wait till you come into your kingdom, and I'm going to be there at your side. Jonathan went back home, and David remained temporarily at Ha-Haresh, the woods. Betrayal, verses 19 through 24. Does anybody have any questions at this point or any comments? Then, verse 19, middle of page 3, Joan, the Ziphites came up to Saul at Gibeah. David's betrayed again, saying, is not David hiding with us in the strongholds at Haresh on the hill of Hakilah, which is the south of Jeshimon? Now then, O king, come down according to all the desire of your soul to do so, and on our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. Now listen to Saul's reaction here. Saul said, may you be blessed of the Lord. Oh, what a spiritual guy he is. May you be blessed of the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. We're going to talk about that phraseology. But he doesn't go with them. Look, listen to what he says. Go now, make more sure, and investigate, and see his place where his haunt is, and who has seen him there. For I am told that he is very cunning, no doubt. Yeah, every time he goes to look for David, he can't find him. So look and learn about all the hiding places where he hides himself, and return to me with certainty, and then I will go with you. And if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah. Then they arose and went to Ziph before Saul. All right? Now, last week we discussed the actions of the leaders of Keilah. And remember, it was revealed that they would surrender David to King Saul. So David left. Now, these were members of David's own tribe. The Ziphites were Judeans. And in light of tribalism, it would be unheard of for a tribe to put the nation's interests before the interests of their own tribe. That's tribalism. Now, it seems times have changed. It's not the same as it used to be. If this occurred during the beginning of Saul's kingship, they would never have done this, because tribalism was embedded in the culture, and it seems that now they're used to a king. Also, we might not understand the impact, and some of you probably do, and maybe you don't, the impact of Saul's unhinged craziness as he was willing to go to great length to capture and kill David. He did the unthinkable. He killed the whole village of serving priests and Levites. He killed the high priest of Israel. This had its impact. The thought could be that the reason for the betrayal was that the Ziphites didn't want any trouble between themselves and Saul. This unhinged king was going to come down and was going to give them, and they were going to have all kinds of problems with this unhinged crazy. And they want nothing to do with that. They took the initiative to alert Saul of David's presence in the area. They decided as a group, the leaders got together, that they would aid Saul in David's surrender. Now, the general political sense is that, they were trying to curry favor with Saul. But I don't get that indication when I read here. I think that this was possibly just pure survival instinct. If this king was willing to kill all those priests and destroy that whole city or village, priestly village of Nob, and kill the high priest, there's no telling what this king will do. I don't think they wanted any trouble. So they're gonna head all this trouble off at the pass. And the Ziphites said, we're not going to wait for Saul to come down here and straighten this mess out. They're going to send a delegation up there, and that delegation was basically like, we'll aid you, we'll help you. We're not aiding David in any way, just so you know. And that's what's going on in these verses. This is survival instinct. Either way, what we have is David is betrayed again by members of his own tribe. We're at the bottom of page 3. 3. Saul is very thankful. We talked about the language of Saul, right? He actually invokes the Lord's name. What a spiritual guy, in blessing them, and thanks them for showing him compassion. Now, when we do see loving kindness and compassion, we've talked about it in the past, lots of times it's the word hesed. And we talked about how it's loving kindness, it's an act of love that one shows to another, an act of faithfulness. But this is not the word that Saul uses. He actually uses the Hebrew word chamal. Now, chamal means pity. And as a matter of fact, this is very humble wording for a king, but he probably used it out of desperation. He's been trying to find David, he can't. And so the behavior, the actions of Ziph, the men of Ziph, coming up to aid him, right, was very humbling. And on his part, he says, you're showing me pity. Thank you. So it's a different word. It maybe show a little bit of the desperation Saul was feeling here. All right, very humble for a king to use chamal. And anyway, so thank you for showing me pity and offering up my enemy for me. And of course, he thanks the Lord because, of course, the Lord's hand was in this. In addition, Saul and probably most of his men were tired of chasing David, only to find that he slipped through their fingers again. And this is what keeps happening, right? They have been on plenty of wild goose chases totally oblivious to the fact, and certainly Saul, that the Lord would never allow him and his men to find David. So what he's done is gone on these wild goose chases. He's going to be after David again. He gets some intelligence. He goes after David only to have David slip through his fingers again. Not this time. Not this time. So he asked them to establish an exact location for David, then report back to him. So they were going to have to go. They were going to have to spy David out. And then, and only then, when they're certain, totally certain where David is, then come back to me and give me a more exact location, and then I'll go. You see why he's hesitant? Him and his men, his own men, are probably tired of these wild goose chases. Saul wants specifics and certainty. Top of page 4. So they left Saul with a mission of finding out about David's favorite hidey holes. And once they get that, now they're good, right? That's the idea here. So now we get to the very end of this chapter, very exciting, about the rock of escape. What happens at the rock of escape? And it says, now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon. Matter of fact, he moved south here, even further south, in the Arabah, to the south of Jeshimon. And when Saul and his men went to seek him, they told David, and he came down to the rock. This is a specific rock that eventually gets named, and stayed in the wilderness of Maon. So he moves himself again a little bit south. We're going to look at the map. And when Saul heard it, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. So he's on David's heels this time. In other words, the Ziphites provided some really good intelligence. And Saul went on one side of the mountain and David on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul, for Saul and his men were surrounding David and his men to seize them. This is desperate. David's caught. But a messenger came to Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid on the land. Verse 28, so Saul returned from pursuing David and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore they called the place, this specific rock, the rock of escape. And David went up from there and stayed in the strongholds of En-Gedi. Right where we are, we talked a little bit about En-Gedi and Masada, Pastor George, while you were gone. So we were there in En-Gedi. It's kind of like a little oasis by the sea. Very neat. And he will be. What's that? Little waterfall, water sources, animals, greenery all of a sudden explodes when you come down the road. It's green. Everything else is brown rock, right? So, En-Gedi. Okay, now we read this, right? David moves his men further south in an area called the wilderness of Maon. Now, let's take a look at the map. Harry, can you bring up that last map? We see Hebron. We see Ziph. If you follow down, if you can look on your paper, but you can look up here. Then you have Haresh, or Ha-Haresh. The woods are in the Ziph area. And then we have Carmel and then Maon. Now, Carmel and Maon is going to have a story in and of itself. We're going to see Abigail, right, and Nabal. That's the setting of that story, and a little bit there. And so David's even further south. He's even further south of En-Gedi and Ziph. I just wanted to orient to what he did. He just moved himself further south, and that's where he stands here at this point in time. Now, Maon is thought to be located, literally, it's 9 miles south of Hebron. So if you take Hebron and you trace that line down, that's about 9 miles. And again, Carmel and Maon is the setting of the story of David, Abigail, and Nabal. That's 1 Samuel. We'll get to it in chapter 25. Now, something that Jeshimon is synonymous with En-Gedi. All right, but Jeshimon means barren or desert, is what the literal interpretation. So I seriously doubt, because that is an oasis in the desert. So if Jeshimon is synonymous with En-Gedi, the description, they wouldn't use that term. So Jeshimon could just be a reference to a known desert region south of the wilderness of Ziph, near En-Gedi. So Jeshimon is probably just, if you were living in Israel at that time, you probably could identify that area as the reference. So he was even further south of Jeshimon. The point is that David gets wind of the betrayal of the Ziphites and moves to a place south of Maon, which would provide plenty of shelter and make it hard for Saul to find him. Apparently, archaeology and those who studied this area, and if we didn't get a chance to get down there, of course, we were on the Dead Sea side, but if we would have traveled over the mountains and we would have traveled west, we could have gone around to this area. We certainly were that far south when we were at Masada, but if we would have gone west a little bit, we could reach this area. But this area is littered with caves, and it has these rock high places as well. Lots of caves, large and small apparently. So that Saul's men would inspect one cave and David could move to another cave. In other words, we have a game of whack-a-mole going on where pop up, pop, pop up, pop. So David would be in this area as his army would pop up, and then Saul would search that cave and he could find another cave. A little bit of whack-a-mole. And that's the idea of David moving his men here. Very good coverage, lots of caves. What we have to understand about this section is that Saul finally had David. He had him. David was dead to rights. David moved to this area quickly, but it seems like not quickly enough. Saul received some good intelligence about David's exact location, and as David moved again, the thing is that what's different this time was Saul was following close behind. I mean, Saul is right on David's trail as he moves south. The author tells us that Saul, even though he might not probably have had David's exact location, he began to surround the area in some sort of pincer movement that David was in. Saul was so close that it says to David that Saul went on one side of the mountain and David and his men were the other side of the mountain. And then it says, and David was hurrying to get away from Saul. In other words, David is surrounded and they're closing in. David was trapped. David was a dead duck. Saul was about to pounce. That's where we're at right here at the end of this chapter. But then, and we talked about this before, in an amazing stroke of serendipity, David and his men were saved. Can you believe it? In what could only be described as pure luck. Absolutely 100% pure luck. For David must have had his lucky rabbit's foot on his person that day, because the Philistines just so happened to launch an attack against Israel. Right at this exact time, a messenger arrived to give Saul the news. And in case you say, well, he is so fixated on David, he never would have left David in the wilderness now that he had him. I think that this attack was so serious, whatever it was, that Saul had no choice. He just had no choice but to turn away from his pursuit of David and return to the north to deal with the Philistines. So I think that you would undervalue this attack of the Philistines if you thought that Saul was going to stay in the south and ignore this attack. This attack was a very dangerous attack, whatever, very serious, that the Philistines had mounted here, and Saul had no choice. Now, there's a saying that we can use nowadays: it is better to be lucky than to be good. Because Saul, you could see, did everything right. From a strategic perspective, he did everything right. Look at what Saul did. He didn't go chasing David and alerting him again. He told the Ziphites to go down, get David's more exact location, right? And then he rode down probably at the perfect time, caught David leaving the wilderness of Ziph and whatever stronghold he was in, got scent of his trail, trapped him, had everything going right, and then boom, from a strategic perspective, he had David. For Saul, what a stroke of bad luck. What an incredible stroke of bad luck. To do everything right and just to lose David just over something stupid like the Philistines attacked. He finally had David right where he wanted him, and the Philistine attack just ruined everything. Poor Saul. Of course, if you understand me and my teaching, you would know that everything I just said was dripping with sarcasm. There is no luck. There is no serendipity. There is a God in heaven with a divine plan who controls all human history from the first event to the last. And most of the finer points of this plan is found in a book that begins with Genesis and ends with Revelation. Stick this in your pipe and smoke it. The Lord used the enemy of Israel to execute his divine plan so that his King David was protected from death in the wilderness of Maon. That's what happened here. The controller of all human history interceded. David and his men could have been captured, and David could have died here in chapter 23, but God. Saul wanted David dead. Satan wanted David dead. God overruled. As usual, people understood God's providence. The people they're smarter than you give them credit for. These ancient people, they understood. So this place was memorialized. They named this rock because of what God did for David. It became known as Selah Hama Lekot. Selah Hama Lekot. Or literally, rock of divisions or rock of escape. God protected David, listen, by putting up a heavenly divide between Saul's men and David's men on the rocky hills of Maon. That's what happened here. And so they named it Rock of Divisions. A heavenly divide was put there so that Saul couldn't get David. The Philistines attacked. And God used them. God used the enemy to protect David. My father made this point with me last week after service, and I think it's a great correlation and application to this passage. Peter warns us in his epistle, be sober in spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Satan wants to devour, destroy, kill, maim. He's used drugs in our lives, in our culture, to just destroy lives. You think Satan isn't behind our drug culture? Of course. Destroy human beings with drugs. Satan is currently using, in our passage, Saul to accomplish his purposes. Saul is devouring. He destroyed the whole village of Nob. That's on Saul the king. He ordered it, even though Doeg the Edomite, his lapdog, is the one who did it. He killed a whole village of innocent men and women because of his dark hatred for David and his desire to have this dynasty at all costs. He wants a dynasty at all costs. He committed an unthinkable act of killing a whole village of priests dedicated to the service of Jehovah. Mayhem and murder among God's own people is exactly what Satan wants. Now, God overruled Satan's plot to now kill David by using an ungodly group of people who invaded Israel by making a decision based on their own desires and purposes. The Philistines invaded Israel not because God made us do it. We must invade Israel. We must invade Israel. No. The Philistines made an actual choice based on what they wanted from Israel, a choice themselves. God did not choose for them. So if you interview the Philistines about this battle, they would say to you, yeah, we chose to invade Israel because we wanted more crops, or we wanted to take this, or we wanted to open up a trade route. They tell you flat out to your face the whole reason why they chose to invade Israel, but God used it in the divine plan to protect David. God didn't make the Philistines invade. They chose to invade. And God uses it all. Our choices and all. I always tell you, strike a balance between human choice and divine sovereignty. It has to be a balance. It's not all one or the other. I'm sorry. Satan wanted David dead. Why? Because the Messiah would come through the family line of David. He wants David dead. Saul wanted David dead because he threatened Saul's dynasty and he realized that God would use David to thwart him. That's Saul's purposes. Satan has a purpose. Saul has a purpose. Both involve David being dead. God overruled both Satan and Saul because his will would be done. David would live. David would rule. The Messiah would be born. The Son of David would walk this earth and he would give his life as a ransom to many. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God that at the rock of escape or rock of divisions, according to the divine plan of his great love, David would be saved and the Messiah would come and we would be blessed. Right. Thanks be to God for his divine plan and his great love for his own creation. Amen. Anyway, sorry, I just went over a couple minutes. I thought it was important to finish today and hit home that application about how God works amongst his people, this amazing plan. We're going to continue to see Saul chase David and how the Lord will thwart Saul and work through these circumstances. Satan wants David dead. Saul wants David dead. God's going to continue to overrule. And that's the way it is. Same thing in your life. God has total control. There's nothing to worry about. A person told me about how they were very nervous driving on the roads nowadays. I'm like, really? I'm not. I'll die by getting hit by a Mack truck if God decides that's how I'm going to die. Otherwise, I'm not worried. I got the controller of human history who is my Abba Father, and he's watching me. I can't hide from him. He knows actually what I'm doing. He knows every breath I'm going to take today. Why am I worried about anything? I don't. Dear Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for just as we watch your divine providence over the life of David, and how you control human history, and how if you are in control of everything, that we don't have to worry about it. If we want control of our lives, that might be a problem. But if we want to give you control, we can let you take care of and handle all the details, and we're just here to serve you, and we worry about other things. So Lord, I just pray that you continue to guide our lives, continue to take these applications, help us to apply these things, help us to bring these things with us throughout the work week, Lord. And I pray that it will be stark, it will be, uplifting, but also that this would spur us on to share our faith with others, share of God's great glory, and share of what we know about our Lord and why we are so happy and why we're so at peace. So just be with